Hello, good. Welcome back again. There's no doubt that work is being transformed as we speak. I've actually been kicked out of my house by my 1-year-old, so I have a new location. And some of us are feeling that our homes have just become our workplaces. I worked on my bed for many hours, and longer hours are just becoming lonelier. The Institute of Work even wrote a new report that came out today called What is Work and What is Personal? Who would have thought they would need to have written that this time last year? Well, others are facing the prospect of reskilling, retraining, and worse, unemployment. In this session, we're going to explore how work is now, and more importantly, potentially what the new future of work looks like. And we need to ensure that everybody flourishes. And so excited about the people that we have today. Don't forget, you can join them in the Q&A afterwards, dig into your own questions and meet the speaker. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce the wonderful Anna Batesman, who's going to introduce you to your speakers and guide you through the session. And I'll see you at the end. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Tabitha. Hello, morning. Welcome to our session on the ever-changing future of work. Pre-pandemic, I think we were beginning to worry about what the future of work would be in terms of the tyranny of the machines, i.e. automation. As James Soosman, the author, said, the relentless cannibalization of the employment market by ever more productive automotive systems and AI. But post-pandemic, if we can say that yet, we're worrying about there being any work at all. As we watch the relentless rise in the number of jobless and the collapse of the city office economy. Work is fundamental to the majority of humanity, determining not just our economic futures, but also our identities, our friends, our values. But capitalism, and primarily Western, i.e. US capitalism, has venerated hard work as a necessary precursor for economic and therefore human success. But the determinism of growth at any cost has increasingly been questioned and alternatives been sought. But while working less, consuming less, and perhaps being happier as a result is appealing to many, our behaviours to the contrary have seemed unchangeable until, I think, the shock of this global coronavirus. And so now it seems it's possible for us to tackle the question of what we want the future of work to be, with more opportunity to contemplate what seemed utopian and idealistic before. And it's interesting to reflect what the virus has fundamentally changed or what it's just accelerated. And so those are some of the kind of issues that I hope we're going to be able to tackle today. And starting us off, we're going to hear from Bruce Daisley, who's the host of the Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat podcast, author, and the former VP of Twitter. Bruce is perhaps one of the world's most influential voices on fixing work. His book was the UK's top-selling business hardback of 2019 and is an international bestseller, having been translated into 14 languages. Previously, he spent over a decade running Twitter and YouTube in Europe, where I was lucky enough to work with him. And when he left Twitter, he was the most senior leader for Twitter outside of the US. And now he runs the Apple chart-topping podcast, Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat, which is all about work culture. And his newsletter reaches tens of thousands of people each week. So thank you, Bruce.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. We're in a fascinating time for work. I think it's clearly we've witnessed more disruption than anyone could have possibly anticipated. But there's almost an inevitability of how the debate is moving on right now. And the way that thinking is being laid out for us is becoming quite dichotomous. The whole of last week, we saw big debates playing out about whether we should be returning to the office. And I think there's clearly a prevalence of the idea that we're going to either have to choose remote working or office working. In fact, when you look into the evidence, the evidence seems far more that people are willing to contemplate a hybrid future. There was some work coming out last week from a professor at Southampton University that suggested a big survey of about 10,000 British adults that suggested that the debate is far more evenly distributed. 88% of people who'd been working remotely said that they wanted to carry on working remotely in some capacity. And in fact, almost half of the people asked said they would like to work remotely all of the time. So it's far more likely that we're going to see some degree of hybrid working. It's really interesting that the debate that we've been seeing played out in the media has not necessarily had that nuance to it. there were times last week where the summary of it that Marina Hyde in The Guardian gave was probably the best example of how we're being told that we need to return to work for the sake of the economy. She said that the new government phrase had become leave work, forget the NHS, save Pret. And I think there's times where we can be told that almost it's our public duty to return to the office. Actually, generally where we are right now, I think most of us have firstly struggled to get through the crisis of a pandemic and found out that we're far more capable of transitioning our way of working than we ever believed possible. But if we think a few moves ahead, I think there's some things on the horizon that give us pause for thought, that make us think a little bit about how our relationship with work is going to transform. And as Anna mentioned, we've always known that our identity is shaped by our jobs. But I think having an awareness of what the strengths and weaknesses of communication through screens and what it's going to mean for us working in a slightly different way is probably an important consideration right now. So some of the lessons of the internet are, someone asked me, can we build communities through screens? Can we find that we build strong, capable work cultures when we're principally communicating through technology? And most certainly the lessons of the internet suggest that most definitely we can build really strong communities. But one of the things that we definitely know is that those communities are most robust when there's a strong affinity between the groups who are connecting there. So it's very easy to build a cohort of people who share an interest through a screen. But often what we find is that our identities and the opinions we form often are rather more polarizing when we communicate through screens. And it gives us an awareness of, as we're thinking ahead and thinking of how we can try to ensure that our companies have some collective identity and the companies that we're working for forge very strong, cohesive cultures amongst the people working there. We need to have a greater awareness of these factors. Certainly, I think one of the things that has been pretty clear through the pandemic and us working remotely is that the experience has been very strongly differentiated. I joined a seminar for one of the London business schools during the pandemic, and one of the lecturers started off by asserting that we were now fortunate to be in the stage of lockdown where everyone had sorted out their home office and set up their working environment. And certainly one of the other callers dialing in from a kitchen probably didn't have that extensive privilege. And it's a good reminder that the experience of lockdown hasn't been evenly distributed. As any of us are thinking about what the future of work looks like, we need to have an awareness that there's a broad experience, there's a broad range of experiences that really sort of shape it in different ways. So I think going forward, probably one of the things that most organizations are going to be increasingly aware of is that in the same way that previously they might have given a consideration to the workplace that they were going to bring people into, now they need to be thinking about this hybrid of people coming into the workplace maybe 2 or 3 days a week, but also working from home. And how do you forge a community of people? It's why I think Daisley is going to be on the Q&A, the panel later. And I think as a community manager, I think this is probably one of the roles that more and more companies are going to be thinking of, how they hire a community manager and the vitality of creating that coherent unit of their employees. Mentioned that there's going to be a balance. Most certainly, I think we're going to see a debate amongst firms about how they bring people back into the office long term. Obviously, we're mid-pandemic right now, and so this isn't necessarily by any means the equilibrium we're going to end up at. Most firms are talking about maybe bringing employees into the office 2 or 3 days a week. And I've been really intrigued with looking into the experience of some of the organizations that have maybe run remote work in the longer term. I really love looking at some of the sort of tech firms that have tried to make sense of this. A lot of the tech firms who came in the second and third wave of the internet used remote working as one of the perks to try and differentiate themselves versus the bigger incumbents. And one of the firms who are really quite interesting to follow are Automatic. They're the company behind WordPress. They say, rather than trying to bring people into the office 2 days a week, by bringing people into the office 2 days a week, you're effectively still shackling people to cities. People still need to be in commuting distance of London, Leeds, Manchester, Edinburgh. They need to be close to big cities. Automatic took a different view. They said, okay, if the old relationship between us and work was that we spend 11 months a year in the office and 1 month a year away from the office, the new relationship that we're proposing is we're going to spend 11 months a year away from our co-workers and 1 month a year with them. And the way that they placed that is they said, okay, we're going to bring people together 1 week a quarter, and we're going to create these energized, caffeinated moments where people are building a community in presence for those single weeks, but then they can go off and work from Boulder, Colorado, Tampa, Florida. They can go and work wherever they want. And it's really interesting. I think we're going to see some extent of the debate about that. Obviously, the consequence of that is our cities, probably if we project forward 5 years, could very conceivably look rather different, because there's going to be, I think by some estimations, Morgan Stanley estimated that if 15 to 20% of work becomes remote, then the demand for office space will fall by about a quarter. So we're going to see that our cities conceivably will look very different, because commercial real estate may well end up being repurposed into residential. So it's not inconceivable that we'll find our cities are a thriving location for young people in their student age, or maybe in their 20s, and then we'll find that these apparently these big demands, increasing demands for housing and property outside of cities. So I think, the challenge right now is that for any of us, making predictions feels like a dangerous place to be. No one can necessarily predict the ripple effects, the cascading impact of all of this change. But I think one thing is almost certain, is that the evidence is that people, having seen so much change this year, actually have developed an appetite for it. This hybrid model of work is almost certainly going to become a new equilibrium, and it just really starts depending on where firms want to set their own criteria. For me, to sort of finish, one of the most fascinating things, I think, is going to be seeing how all of this plays out. One of the other remote-only firms, Basecamp, talk about their perspective is that in their working situation, in their working culture, they say meetings are a last resort. And I think a lot of us, having endured 20 or 30 hours of Zoom calls per week over the last 6 months, would love to find ourselves in a situation where meetings are a last resort. More than anything, I think we are going to see a real differentiation between the way that some firms set out their culture, how they create their working environment, and the websites like Glassdoor that allow people to come and review the working situation that they're in, and the culture that their organization has created, probably are going to come into their own. People are going to be able to see a very differentiated experience between different firms. So to summarize my introduction, fascinating time. I think that hybrid model is almost certainly an inevitability now. And it just really, the question is where firms are going to set themselves up on the dials of what that looks like.
Thank you, Bruce. So I'm going to introduce the panel now. And just before I do, I just want to say you're very possible to ask questions during this session. But just please, if you could put your name in, it's optional in the functionality, but it'd be really helpful if you could add your name. So to the panel. First, Abadesi Osunade, who's the VP of Global Community and Belonging at Brandwatch. Abadesi was recently included in the Financial Times list of top 100 influential leaders in tech, and Tech Nation's 50 most prominent and influential voices in tech. And prior to her current role, she worked at Product Hunt, Alpha, Amazon, Hotel Tonight, and Groupon. And in 2016, she published her careers advice book, Dream Big, Hustle Hard, a millennial woman's guide to success in tech. Khalet is the director of AI ecosystems for the machine learning group at Arm. In this role, Kate oversees all AI and machine learning ecosystem partnerships and developer relation activities. She works closely with partners and influencers to create disruptive AI applications on ARM-based technologies. Kate joined Arm from Intel in 2019, where she'd previously spent 6 years holding various product and business positions in AI, computer vision, and IoT, including developing the world's first AI developer stick in a USB form factor. And finally, Sachin Dev Dugal, who's CEO of Builder AI. Builder AI is a platform that offers 360 software service for entrepreneurs and enterprises to build, run, and scale any idea without the need for coding. At the age of 22, Sachin co-founded Niveo, one of the world's first cloud computing companies that let users stream Windows from the cloud in a browser, and offering an app store that allowed users to rent software from Adobe, Corel, and Microsoft. And I want to start with you, Sachin, actually. So if we all agree that the digital transformation that we've been talking about for years has sort of been compressed and accelerated in the last few weeks, I was wondering, given that you're at the sort of coalface of helping organizations adapt to the new way of working, and indeed you were awarded the CogXtra COVID-19 Recovery Award for your work with helping SMBs digitize, I wondered if you could tell us a bit about what you're seeing, how what you're doing with Builder AI is helping businesses sort of adapt and connect with their customers, and just generally observations about the particular challenges that you're seeing SMBs, particularly who don't necessarily have the resources in place to kind of cope with this new these new normal ways of working.
Awesome, thank you so much. So look, I think the most important thing we saw was sort of when this hit, which was the second week of February. You know, we saw a lot of the top of the funnel change, and it was almost, you know, as if the market had completely stopped. And then even more interesting was 2 weeks later, it came back resurgent. And we had a brand new type of customer sort of looking to figure out what they were going to do to stay relevant in a world where either their primary storefront had shut down because of the lockdown, or it was going to be heavily constrained. And so this took us back to why we started Builder. We started it because we believed that small businesses were going to digitally transform. We knew that the lines between the digital economy and the sort of the traditional brick and mortar economy was blurring, but we sort of thought that was going to take 3 or 4 years. And if you were going to let small businesses sort of make that jump, you needed to make it almost as sort of as easy as ordering pizza for them. Otherwise, you were creating a larger and larger chasm for them to be able to cross. And so what we've seen through COVID is whether it's like the Mumbai grocer or the staffer at the Indian Army, and one of the projects we ended up working on was to do food distribution during COVID-19 for servicemen, so that they were able to get essential sort of access to food and whatnot by the army in sort of this period where everything was being sort of fairly constrained. And what we found through every sort of small business conversation that at least I've sat on some of these chats and heard customers is that no one wants to be told that they're going to be irrelevant. And many small businesses are very nervous now more than ever before because, you know, in 6 months they may not be around. But they don't want to be told they're going to be irrelevant. I think the second thing is they don't want to be told that just because they don't quite understand how to write software or how product management or coding is done, they sort of struggle with this idea that just because they can't do this and they've never had to be able to become an expert in other things, they won't be in business anymore. And so what we realized was that this was sort of a prime opportunity to look at what these businesses are after. And so their concern stems from, you know, if you're a restaurant, we've had many restaurants that we've been speaking to that are trying to build solutions, and it's right the way from how do I let my customers feel safe that they can come into the restaurant and, you know, if there was a problem or somebody had it, you know, they just feel safe coming into a property. Right the way through to restaurants thinking about, well, I've lost a quarter of my year, I've lost 30% capacity because of social distancing requirements. How do I, you know, do 60% more business in the remaining year? And that requires them to think about their business differently, whether it's delivering, whether it's, you know, allowing customers to buy loyalty cards, it's engaging with customers more digitally. It's not just good enough to have their store running. And so through this entire experience, what we found is that if we allow customers a way to be able to transact with their customers, even when they're not there in person, so wherever the customer is, if we allow our merchants, whether they are retailers or restaurants, we've got a nursery that's building something right now, and we allow them to be able to give customers peace of mind that, it's okay to come here, but also you can interact with us from your living room. That's a way that they're going to start rebuilding their next business. And so COVID becomes almost like this opportunity for them to accelerate in the world that they sort of found themselves in, and to use this time to really build their digital future, which otherwise it was something that was periphery and they were going to do it, but maybe they weren't going to do it, and now they realize they have to do it. And I think the thing that's been really resurgent to us is to see how well thought out small businesses are in terms of what they want to build, but at the same time, how nervous they are on the fear of failure. It's like this is their last opportunity to get this right. And they already sort of see the writing on the wall if they don't make that move. And so I think those things are really quite critical when we think about sort of that small business engagement and interaction. And I think the last thing, and that's more from a platform perspective, is we're starting to see people build the same things. It's why we launched the Studio Store, because we started to see many small businesses wanting to build engagement, commerce, restaurant booking, menuless premises. And we started to see that actually everyone was trying to build the same thing, and it didn't make sense for these companies to be spending £10,000, £20,000 when they could get the same thing for £200 or £300. And the amount of customization they need is fairly minimal. And that lended really well to what we had built more for an enterprise perspective, but this idea that most software is common, and 80% of all the features that exist in just about every application are pretty much the same. So could we not actually just do something for small businesses that would allow them to go to market really quickly, leverage all that reusable feature set, but also guide them through the process of rolling it out, so that they had a foothold in what the future of how they were going to work.
Thank you. So building on this idea of the strength of an ecosystem and people being able to learn from one another, Kate, I wonder if you could just talk about that in the context of your work, because this seems to be the definition of what you're trying to do, of working with an ecosystem and empowering an ecosystem and allowing it to become healthy through kind of mutual sort of support.
Sure. From an ecosystem perspective, in the work I'm doing today, I guess one of the things which is important to remember is that ecosystem is actually the power of community. A lot of tech companies have used developers as an extension of their workforce to come up with innovative applications. And this is exactly what the power of ecosystem is. It's more minds, more people driving more innovation to solve some of the world's most complex problems. If you look at what happened when the pandemic hit, we've seen the research community, we've seen the data science community, we've seen the developer community all coming together and try to find ways to protect, to detect COVID-19. We've seen applications such as COVIDNet, which is a neural network helping doctors identify X-rays which have been which are infected with pneumonia in the context of COVID-19, right? And this came from a startup which partnered with the rest of the developer community, open sourced the model, worked with hospital to also feed more data in the data set, and build a really robust model. And that's a perfect example of the community and the ecosystem coming together. We've also seen big organizations such as the UN Development Programme partnering with tech companies such as ARM, such as Arduino, and also communities like Hackster.io to bring in innovative minds from the developer community to help build devices which could potentially help communities and more vulnerable countries respond to the pandemic. So I guess from my perspective, working with the developer community has been going to a lot of conferences, a lot of workshops, engaging with them face to face. But going back to something that Bruce was saying, we had to reassess the way we were engaging with developers, and we had to do it through screens. And I think this, if there is one positive thing that the pandemic has brought to the ecosystem, is really strengthen the global ecosystem. I've been looking at communities such as Zindi, who is trying to solve some of the most complex problems on the African continent, for example, grow from 5,000 to 14,000 data scientists and developers. And every week they were trying to solve, they were launching a hackathon, which was dedicated to solving a specific problem in the context of COVID-19 and on the African continent. So it has been really amazing for me to see the response and how the community has come together without being able to meet and without being able to exchange face-to-face, but just through screens and with one sole purpose, which was to make lives better and help everybody in the world fight against the pandemic.
It's very interesting there, because one of the comments that I've heard consistently is the fundamental kind of democracy and equality of when everyone is remote. That previously there was a sort of inequality of some people being in a place and other people being remote, and now everybody is equally remote or equally close together, and what that can then enable. Abadesi, so you have the coolest kind of job title of all time. I was wondering, did you take the job pre-pandemic? And if so, what do you feel has fundamentally changed about what you need to do and how you're going to do it, given we're now in a different sort of situation?
Yeah, I feel what community stands for is very different. So this job, actually, really the catalyst for this role being created was Black Lives Matter in June. I had done work with Brandwatch in the past through my social enterprise hustle crew, working with them to help them understand bias, privilege, and structural oppression better so that they can make more equitable decisions. And over summer, as Black Lives Matter started playing out, the team became very conscious of the fact that they, as a team, did not represent the cities in which they were based, whether that's New York, Boston, or Brighton. And they really wanted to do something quite urgently about that. So it was really interesting to be a part of this conversation and really sort of create the role throughout the recruitment process. Having done a community manager role at Product Hunt before, and also being the entrepreneur of a community business, I feel very strongly that anything related to equity, belonging, inclusion must have at its core community. It can't be something that's achieved in a silo. It can't be something that's achieved only by the groups which face prejudice or are oppressed. I felt that the key to belonging really is community. And I also felt that, to your point, what community stands for and what community is changing, it's evolving, and it really, in a way, is culture. It's what each of us as individuals bring to the company every time we show up and do our work. So it's interesting because, we were really just co-creating the role as we discussed it throughout the recruitment process. And in many ways, even though I'm in my 6th week, I feel like we're still trying to define exactly what that role is, because, we're a company of over 500 people distributed all around the world, to the point that, Bruce and Kate have already made, and Sachin as well. The way we are dealing with COVID and the pandemic happens in real time. And we all have different levels of privilege, different levels of competence around this. So it's a huge task to understand what building a community of engaged and, recognized employees means. And I think that's really the challenge. And, if folks are watching this panel and, leaders in their own organizations or leaders in their community and thinking, how can I adapt to the future of work? I think it's really about listening to people at this stage. And that's everything that I've been trying to do. I mean, like I said, I've been at the company just over 5 weeks, but I've had over 50 one-to-ones with people all across the organization, from C-suite all the way down to individual contributors, people who've worked at the company since its inception, all the way through to people who've just been there for a few months or a couple of years. And I think, to Bruce's point, more and more companies will need to create a dedicated role for community that allows an individual to have as their main responsibility listening to the needs of the individuals and ensuring that resources are diverted to solve their problems. I think one of the biggest challenges of this time is that you have a lot of people who actually didn't choose to be remote workers, becoming remote workers. And yes, they like it, they enjoy it, but they want that balance. They want some flexibility. There are people who just don't have that setup at home. There are people who are juggling childcare needs. There are people who have other dependents, other things going on. So I think the onus is on employers to really start digging deep into the pockets and making some difficult choices about how to support the range of individual needs to make sure that each person still feels like they're valued and still feels like they belong in the future, even though we're not sure what that looks like.
So Bruce, you left a very big job at arguably a relatively enlightened company when it comes to the sort of, work and the future of work, to run your podcast and to write sort of full time. And you took that decision pre all of the pandemic. And I wondered why you took the decision, but also what's changed for you in the way that you think about that during this kind of, during lockdown.
Yeah, I think the reason for me was that I'd got into being consumed with workplace culture and understanding how to make it work better through a necessity, really. Through a series of personal mistakes myself, I'd helped to hash up the culture that we'd had at Twitter, and we'd gone from being something that felt energized and heroic to in 1 year I saw 40% of our London team leave. And so I found myself thinking, right, what can be the solution to unwind that problem, to fix that? And what I discovered was, I do a podcast and newsletter, various things. What I discovered was there's a whole community of people who are looking for direction in those things. They're looking for evidence-based examples of how to make their own workplaces better. We spend so much of our waking time and so much of our attention on our jobs, and trying to make it in any way life affirming rather than life sapping seems to be a noble cause, really. And so I just found myself consumed with that. I don't think anyone fully anticipated the extent of change that was going to go on. I found myself, I'm very much an enthusiast for, when you look into the evidence of how we form cohesive units, physical presence and being around people often is a very difficult one to substitute. And I think probably one of the things that we're going to be increasingly aware of as we go through the various stages of this is that loneliness is going to be something that can sometimes get hidden in the data. I mentioned before, 88% of people want to keep some degree of remote working. What's hidden in all of the evidence is that 10% of people say that their mental health has reached something of a crisis level. So I think, we're in a zone where it was probably an unrealistic expectation for work to provide our friendship, but it did provide some degree of companionship and some degree of connection that sometimes that can be lost. The people in the periphery of groups can be lost. And so I think, an awareness that going forwards, we need to have a holistic view of how the experience of work for everyone can be enhanced is a really critical thing, I think.
So I'm interested like that, and I'm interested to extend the sort of question more broadly to each of you. This idea of how we work, and this sense of, I think we all would agree that whatever the future of work is going to be a hybrid, and it's not going to be the same as it was before. But I think this idea of how you balance creative processes with sort of task completion, and really we had sort of almost like a one size fits all before, and that we went to the office, we got together and we did these things. Now that doesn't seem to be so kind of appropriate. How we think about whether or not, how we delineate between personal and professional now, because it seems to be so difficult given that there's no clear, previously the commute, the office, the return meant that there was this divide between your personal life and your work life, and what that means for people. And also this idea of how you cease to be available, because in a way, one of the great things about kind of flexible working, remote working, is that you get agency in it, you get to decide. But perhaps what that then kind of in a negative way can lead to is that it's very difficult to no longer be available. So it's brilliant that you could theoretically work from any location, but then how do you not work when you want to sort of switch off work? And I wondered if each of you could just give some thoughts or observations that you've seen about how we might think about that going forward, because there's clearly no obvious solution, but there are obviously experiments or kind of successes that perhaps we're seeing. And perhaps Sachin, I don't know if you have something that you could offer.
Yeah, sure. So, I think for us as a company, and maybe when I think about our ecosystems, maybe I start internally. So we're sort of split between 3 locations, Los Angeles, London, and New Delhi, London and Delhi being the 2 bigger hubs. And a lot of how our teams have worked, not just during COVID, but before, is that most of our company is broken into squads. And each location contributes into at least 2 locations contributing to a squad. So a part of remote working was always a part of our sort of DNA and culture and how we were operating. That being said, we still had offices that people could at least meet with and work with. I think what I've seen, and from what I've heard from the teams over the last 3 or 4 months, is that everyone feels they're doing just a lot more work. And I think it's because the sort of, as you'd mentioned, right, the boundaries between being at home and not at home have just blurred. And I think in the beginning, it was a lot of, oh, I'm working from home. And the minute you say the word home, you sort of feel like, well, it's, in my head, at least for me, the trigger was, well, I'm actually at home, so I can do that one thing extra, and I can do this piece because I have that freedom to go say hello to my kids in the middle or something or the other. What that very quickly turned to was, oh my God, I'm actually doing so much more work, whether it's just sitting in front of a screen, not moving as much, or starting earlier, closing later than I was before. And so for organizations, and especially like ours, there's been a lot of trying to figure out, actually, our teams are working more. And everyone knows that with the pandemic, there's also just generally more stress. Working from home, where there's less break now and it's more continuous, and especially where folks are living with friends or they're sharing apartments, or their significant other is also working, actually also adds to it. So a lot of what we've then switched to is, how are we thinking about programs that allow people to release some of that stress? And so whether it is folks just having lunch with colleagues whilst we still don't have offices operating, we're thinking about, obviously no one's really going on holiday, and I think in the summer some people did, but how are we going back to folks and saying, look, this team, why don't you have a 4-day week for the next 2 weeks? Or how do we get people to start using some of their vacation time, or give additional vacation time, just so that they can actually just switch off and take 3 days off or 4 days off? Because we need to start balancing the amalgamated stress that's coming in on the flip side. And then I think the last part is sort of our second ecosystem. So we work with about 150 dev shops around the world, where we're working with their teams, their designers, their developers, and a lot of what we've been trying to figure out, and this has sort of been a perennial problem for us, and we've been building and iteratively improving it, but it's become interesting during COVID, is this is like an extended organization to us, even though they are supply. So in some respects, we have to build things for them that make their life easier, especially because they're also now not going into workplaces and they're working from home. So the same things that we're trying to solve for our own teams, we sort of need to solve for them, because otherwise the customization work that they do for our customers on our platform, is going to get affected, because if people get more stressed, then the output gets affected. So we're finding ourselves having to deal or think about how communities that we previously weren't really responsible for, but were interacting with, we now have to actually think about how they're going to be reacting and behaving and building things through, because we're trying to balance this, internal organization, customer community, and then supply or designer developer community, and make sure that in this world where everybody's just a lot more stressed out, how are we being able to still deliver and keep everyone happy in the process?
And Kate, how are you seeing the sort of balance of positives and negatives? I think because in a sense, you were very kind of optimistic in some ways about the kind of the sort of the power of the community. But I just wondered if you see that. Anyway, over to you.
I think, like Sachin mentioned, there are two folds to that question. There is the internal ecosystem and the external ecosystem. From my team's perspective, when all this started, it was really, really hard for us because we are an external-facing team. And a couple of developer relations managers in my team came to me and said, Kate, what are we going to do? Our whole work relies on engaging with the developer community, going to conferences, going to workshops. We're always in a plane. We don't know what to do anymore. How are we going to do that? We all sat down and said, well, we're going to figure it out. Let's go and listen from developers. Let's go and listen from people who have built communities, online communities, Kaggle, Indie, and such. And after, I think, a month and a half, I see an amazing change in the way my team had taken the pandemic and the changes. And all of a sudden, they were completely energized. And they said to me, hey, actually, we need to turn this into an opportunity because when we were physically going to attend conferences, we were touching maybe 8,000, 2,000, 3,000 developers. But all of a sudden, we have the potential to have an impact on tens of thousands of developers, hundreds of thousands of developers. And actually, borders don't matter. It's not because we attend, it's a US conference that only Americans will be able to attend. We can actually open the doors to everybody in the world. And that's the opportunity that they saw in the way things change. It was hard. It was very sudden for us, but we managed to turn it into an opportunity. On the flip side, the external ecosystem was kind of the same as well. And when I was talking to some community builders out there, AI community builders, they turned to me and they said, "Well, yeah, our community have grown tenfold, and now we need to keep them engaged." We've seen data scientists, some of them losing their jobs, some of them not being able to go to school, to attend university because of the pandemic, and we need to keep them engaged. We want to give them the tools to be able to work on something that's meaningful and help communities and help the world within during this pandemic, right? So they also saw an opportunity to this change and the way they were interacting with their community. So yeah, I might be a big optimistic, but I think if like I said before, if one positive thing this pandemic has given to us is really the impact and the potential to have an impact on communities beyond borders and get everyone together to really help solve some of the world's most pressing challenges, but also local challenges. I've seen developers in Senegal asking us for help to build a robot to support health workers in their hospitals there. You see developers in Rwanda who are working on completely digitalizing mobile payments to be able to go completely cashless, which they actually managed to do when the pandemic hit. Yeah, if I have to say one thing is this opportunity to have an impact and to help people beyond borders and to help communities and developers beyond borders.
Abadasi, if you had to rewrite your book now, thinking about sort of, kind of success, etc., do you think would you write it differently? I mean, do you think there are going to be different dynamics now to drive success in this new way of working?
Absolutely. It's funny that you ask about the distinction between our personal and our professional life, and also what healthy boundaries we can create now that these spaces have merged. And when I wrote my book, it was obviously way before I could have predicted a pandemic or could have predicted that more and more companies would be moving towards having distributed teams. And I didn't put any focus really on how we as individuals can maintain those boundaries within our own lives. And I think it's so important to do that now, because the reality is we are always on. And if I think of a company like Brandwatch, which is transitioning to be remote optimized, but historically has not been, we still have a culture that leans into synchronous working, that leans into having as many meetings as possible because we're used to convening as a group to ideate and push projects forward. Now that we're working from home and we all have different levels of commitments in these working from home spaces, it becomes a lot harder to maintain the momentum we had when we were all in the same room. And also it becomes a lot harder for us to maintain our individual energy levels. So, I'm thinking about what are the tools and frameworks and best practices that we all need at an individual, but also company level to enter this new way of working. And I think that's really important. Like, first of all, as individuals, for us to be really clear and realistic really with our team about what hours we're going to be online, and also develop that habit of asking for deadlines. A lot of the time people will ping you any time of day and say, can you give me feedback on this, or when's that? And I think we need that habit as individuals to say, when do you need to know by? Because then we take that power back and we can plan our days and we're not just waiting to react to inbound messages. The second thing I think is really important is what we're doing at Brandwatch, which is developing like a playbook. The fact is we've now got hundreds of people that have never been in distributed teams forced into this life. And, the smallest things, like when do you actually need to have a meeting versus collaborating on a cloud-based document? When do you actually need to be online at the same time as your team versus having the flexibility to work to a schedule that makes sense for you? I feel like there's also a ton of etiquette that we've never really talked about because, when you're just together in a physical space, things like meetings sort of like flow naturally, but now we've moved online. So, should we always have our videos on? How do we encourage people who are a bit more quiet to actually participate and get involved? From an inclusion and diversity perspective, I think there's actually like huge opportunity now for our teams to be more representative and for us to have more balance of opinions in every conversation we have, because to the point everyone's made, there is a bit of a leveler going on when we are all at home and when we are all participating virtually. So now it's about creating those processes that make sure, with this incredible opportunity of leveling things out, how do we get every single person involved at the decision-making table and make sure that we are supporting them as companies to excel in their roles? And as individuals, I think we just need to be a bit more explicit with what we need. Here's an incredible opportunity for change. No one has the answers, so we get to create the answers together. And I think, if I were to write the book again now, I would say, be vocal about what you need to succeed and what you need to be productive, because that is what the company owes you. That is the way that transaction works.
And on that, I think we're now out of time, but I would point everyone to the fact that there is a Q&A. I think it starts in 15 minutes. There's clearly a lot more to talk about. So please do ask questions and we can carry on the conversation. And thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. That was really fascinating. It makes me feel a lot better that you're all thinking about these things, and I'm hoping that we can actually take forward some of your advice. I thought, Abadesi, there were some things there I thought my team could definitely start doing today, like keeping our videos on. Obviously, can't escape that this morning. I will see you all in the after the Q&A. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the session.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.